Well, good afternoon. Thanks for sticking around, and I hope you all continue to eat. And while we have our third and final panel, fortunately, I will not be talking about the Dormant Commerce Clause doctrine. Mike thought that after lunch that would just simply induce dormancy in everybody. So we have many more exciting topics. Earlier today, we heard from panelists about the formation of the regulations that have governed the alcoholic beverage industry for the last 80 years and the benefits of those regulations. It's been a real success story. I think Pam Erickson put it just right when she said, we have the most incredible alcohol control regime in the world. And the fact that we don't have people who die from, counterfeit alcohol and all is a testament to that. So not only have these regulations prevented the abuses that brought about prohibition, but they've also fostered, and Mike made this point, a dynamic and competitive industry with significant economic impact. But the system in place today frequently faces challenges that surface in regulatory agencies, legislatures, and the court. These challenges are coming from large retailers seeking to corner more market share in beer, wine, and spirit sales, small craft suppliers seeking exemptions to existing statutory statutes and rules, and large multi-state distributors seeking to expand their footprint, and think tanks that want government out of most commerce. So let's take a quick look at some of the challenges that are surfacing. Small suppliers seek exemptions to three-tier and related laws, tied house challenges from players in all three tiers, moves to liberalize trade practice laws and regulations and ease licensing requirements. Direct shipment of alcohol is still a perennial issue that arises. Large suppliers buying small suppliers in order to gain the benefit of their exemptions. Privatization of control state system, and then attacks on pricing regulations. We have a dynamic panel of experts to further explore these challenges and discuss the impact they could have on industry and on public safety. First, we got Jessica Starns, who is an alcohol law attorney from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and former executive counsel to the Louisiana Office of Alcohol and Tobacco Control. Jessica has authored numerous laws and regulations at her home state. She's been a frequent speaker at state and national conferences, and she just completed a major research paper exploring the timeless value of laws that protect the independence of the three tiers of the alcohol industry. And I think we have copies on the table outside. Vicky McDowell is the president of the President's Forum of the Distilled Spirits industry with deep experience with the control state model of alcohol regulation, such as it exists in Pennsylvania. Prior to joining the President's Forum, Vicky served as a deputy administrator of TTB. Prior to her appointment as deputy administrator, she was assistant administrator for field operations at the TTB. And last but not least, Lester Jones is the chief economist at the National Beer Wholesalers Association and a frequent and enjoyable speaker at state and national conferences and a sought-after source for economic information on the alcohol beverage industry. We'll ask each panelist to provide initial remarks, and I think we're generally just going to try to have a little bit of a conversation here and leave plenty of time for questions, but in the spirit of creating some conversation here, if you have some during the presentation, just don't hesitate to jump in. So first, I'd like to ask Jessica to give us a general overview of some of the challenges out there with a special emphasis on the research you just completed.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you all today from Louisiana and get to experience an actual day of weather for once this winter weather for once this season, because it was 85 degrees when I left there. I'm very thankful for the center inviting me to be here and for also recently giving me the opportunity to write this paper. And if you guys saw it out front, this is what it looks like. For the past year, I have been in private practice, 1 year to this month actually. And in my private practice, I have two components. One side, I do governmental affairs and lobbying. And then on the other side of my practice, I do business compliance, business licensing and regulatory compliance work. So I represent several craft brewers and distillers and cideries, and I also represent numerous retail outlets. And so I basically work across the segments of the industry. Prior to that, I was the executive counsel for the Louisiana Office of Alcohol and Tobacco Control, and in that role, I was responsible for drafting all of our legislation and regulations and working with our legislator to educate them. And I oversaw our enforcement and our licensing groups, as well as our legal division. So I got to see a lot of what's going on in the industry and challenges that we were facing, threats to the system. So that is kind of the focus of the paper and what I'm going to talk to you about on. As discussed in the earlier panels, well, when Todd was speaking, I was like, wait, did you steal one of my past presentations from when I was at the agency? Because this all sounds so familiar. I mean, down to the handout of how to check an ID, because you would think that it's pretty basic, but apparently it's not so basic. So I was really impressed that they had that. But with alcohol being such a unique commodity, as was discussed in the other panels and the history leading up to Prohibition and then establishing the system that's been in place since Prohibition, the beauty of that is that each state gets to make their own rules and regulations and decide what's best for their people, and they don't have to worry about much interference from the federal government or anyone else. However, I have noticed from speaking to people in other states, and when I was at the agency in Louisiana, I would frequently reach out to other states when an issue would come up. Hey, have you dealt with this? What did you do? How has it worked? Like, do you recommend doing the same thing? There's just a lot of common issues across the states, and the issues tend to come in waves and trends, and they float around, and then there's the next issue. So it's a continuous cycle. So I think that it's very good for each state regulatory agency and lawmaking body to speak with other states and look around when they're making decisions, because, although a decision may seem pretty minor at the time it's being made, like, oh, well, we're just going to allow common ownership if people have 5% or less. Those decisions build up over time. A bunch of small decisions ultimately become massive policy changes, and they have long-term effects that are often very negative, and once they're made, it's just pretty much impossible to get that genie back in the bottle. So when you're thinking about making changes as policymakers, you need to make sure that they're well researched and thought out and really rooted in public safety concerns and consensus driven. Policymakers are in an unenviable position of having pressure come from them at all different angles. From within the industry, you have conflicting goals from the suppliers and the wholesalers and the retailers, and then you have, even within the segments, conflicting interests between the large guys and the small guys, and then outside of the industry from public health groups. So a lot of people frequently coming at you wanting to get their policy agenda passed, and you really have to look at that and determine for the whole what is the best for the citizens of your state and what is the best for maintaining the integrity of the system going forward, because eventually you can get to the point where you have more exceptions than rules, and unfortunately I think that that's the case in many places in the trend, and it just gets really hard to defend a system or explain why you have a system anymore once you get to that point. So I think that it's very important to be cognizant of that. So many of the problems stem from the inherent dichotomy between the role of business and then the concern of the public safety dealing with alcohol, because on the one hand, alcohol brings in millions of dollars to state and local revenues. It's a great industry, employs thousands and thousands of people. It's just really good for the country. But on the other side, it's costly. We have, as discussed in the first panel, we have all of the health implications and crime and things that we have to look at, and that's not a result of alcohol, per se. That's a result of the abuse of alcohol. And the purpose of the system that we have and that we're trying to maintain is not to unduly burden business. I mean, I think that most regulators and policymakers want to be friendly to business. The purpose is to prevent that abuse and to ensure that the industry can keep moving forward as it's done for the past 83 years without going back to the problems that led to prohibition ultimately. And I think, a lot of business groups today and special interest groups will argue to you, well, I mean, this is 2017. We don't need laws that they passed in 1930s. Like, that's crazy. Everything's changed so much. The business climate has changed so much. These laws are outdated. They're illogical. They harm free trade. Modern corporate structuring makes them irrelevant. And those things are just really untrue, because the fact of the matter is that alcohol hasn't changed. I mean, what has changed is we have a lot more products. There's over 142,000 products registered in the United States today, alcoholic beverage products that consumers have to choose from. We've become much more sophisticated. The alcoholic beverage products are a much better quality and more diverse, but the effect of consuming it is still the same. And the effect of over-consuming it is still the same. You're still going to end up in the hospital. You're still going to have a hangover. You still have the driving while intoxicated issues. So that hasn't changed. And then on the business end, I mean, the modern corporate form started over 400 years ago. And the goal then and the goal now was to maximize profits. There's always been a tendency towards vertical integration. That hasn't changed. So, and also for hundreds of years, there's been a effort to have a more globalized marketplace because people want to maximize their profits. So really, when they argue that this system is no longer needed, that all of those things have changed, it's just not true. When they say modern corporate structuring, okay, great, you've diversified, you've made numerous subsidiaries. Well, all that does is blur the lines and make it harder, to track things. And obviously, there's great corporate reasonings for doing that, and I'm not knocking that at all. But I'm just saying, having an ownership in a parent company gives you an ownership in a subsidiary. And this notion that, with the rise of mutual funds and crowdfunding and all of these investment groups having an ownership stake in most businesses, I think 78 to 80% of all publicly traded companies today are owned by 5 investment firms. Like the common ownership is significant across that, and they're not passive shareholders. There's evidence and studies that show, and the Department of Justice has been investigating this, they're actively engaged in the decision-making of all the companies that they are on the boards of and that they have an interest in. So we just really need to keep protecting against those things. Their fiduciary responsibility is to their shareholders to maximize the profits. There's no fiduciary responsibility of social control. And that's not to say that, so when the businesses are pushing for exceptions and they want to keep pushing the boundaries, you give them an inch, so the policymakers will say, oh, okay, well, we're just going to go ahead and give them this exception. Well, they're going to take that exception and they're going to push it a mile, and then they're going to come back and they want another mile. It's just not going to stop. And, that's not a bad thing. Like, businesses aren't bad, evil people. That is what they exist to do. So obviously that's what they're going to go for. But on the other side, as policymakers, we have to be cognizant of the public health concerns and represent that aspect of society to keep things balanced. So we have to, just not give in to the varying special interest groups to, for their mission of deregulating to increase profits. A lot of the changes that are being sought today, privatization, for example. So I come from a licensing state. Louisiana is a licensing state. And it makes things a lot more difficult because a lot of the things that the system is set up to prevent or keep in check is, the ability of one group of the industry to have control or domination over the other, and keeping the market open and to allow for new businesses and to allow for growth and to allow for more consumer choice and allow small businesses to be able to succeed in this industry. Those things are all, in a privatized system, they all become a lot more difficult to enforce and regulate just because you have the private sector control and involvement in your process. So as you seek to privatize, those are things that you should consider and look at, that will require increased enforcement efforts and expenses there. And then you will be faced with a lot of challenges that you're maybe not currently faced with, such as dealing with the vertical integration issues and the common ownership and de minimis interest. Those things will come into play. Some other issues that are going on, carve-outs. So your small in-state guys will say, well, we just can't get our product to market. We just can't grow. We need an exception. Please create an exception just for us. And then what they don't realize or understand, and this is something that I often speak to my clients on and try to educate them on, the system as it is really good for them, because with this system, they are allowed to get their product to market, and they are allowed to get a distributor. If you give them an exception, you set yourself up for, with each carve-out you do, whether it's given an exception there, any kind of carve-outs to law, you set yourself up for legal challenges. So, for example, if you give an exception to the small guys or your in-state guys, well, you can bet that you're going to be sued by large suppliers out of state who are going to argue, this is a violation of the Commerce Clause, because even though we have the 21st Amendment and states have their own authority to regulate alcohol how they choose, the courts have well spoken that provisions such as the Comity Clause and the Equal Protection Clause and the Commerce Clause, the Dormant Commerce Clause, those all are still in effect. So when you're making decisions, you have to make sure that whatever you're doing is going to be open to everyone, or else you're going to be in court, and then you're going to have to go back and rework the decisions. Obviously, large suppliers will argue, well, that's not fair. Why can they self-distribute? Or why do they get to do that and we don't? You're just treating us differently because we have a bigger business. So that's always something to look at. And those challenges are not going to stop. They're going to continue coming. So if you think like, okay, we're going to agree to do this, well, the next session or the next year, it's going to be something else, and they're going to want to do something a little bit more. What I often advise my clients to do, I think that education is key in making the groups understand why we are where we are today, how we got here, and what can happen if we don't maintain an effective system. If you look at the soft drink industry, there are 150 Coke syrup makers across the country. If you're not Coke or Pepsi, you're not getting into the industry. It's very difficult to get your products to the market. And if you go, because they can do things like pay-to-play schemes, and because they can do exclusive agreements and contracts, if you go to McDonald's, you're not going to get a Pepsi product. And if you go to Taco Bell, I'm not sure if y'all have Taco Bells here, but if you have a Taco Bell, you're not going to get a Coke. It's just not going to happen. And so with the alcohol industry, the arguments that, well, we can't grow, large groups are controlling everything, it's just really not true. And in my paper, I have a lot of bullet points and data on this, and I also have summaries of a lot of case law that's going on around the country right now. A huge case out of Texas called Cadena that's being considered by the Supreme Court right now about common ownership and some of these issues. But just so you can see the challenges that when you make these exceptions and these carve-outs, the challenges that you're going to face. The industry in the U.S. is growing significantly. Today there's over 6,000 breweries. Approximately 92% of those are small craft breweries. 85% of all the beer sold in the country is domestically produced. The industry grew by 700 breweries, give or take a few, from 2014 to 2015. So that's a big growth for a year. And there are over 7,800 wineries in the U.S. 78% of those are boutique wineries. So because of this system, everyone has a chance to enter this market and be successful in it. The goal of segregating segments of the industry is not just limited to alcohol either. That's an argument that I received a lot when I was a regulator. Well, why do we only do this for alcohol? This just seems unfair. It's really burdensome for us. That's not true. Many states have mandated divorcement in the refinery industry because refinery-owned retail outlets were raising the wholesale prices so independent gas stations can't compete. Then you look at the effects of vertical integration in the media industry. Well, basically 6 companies control all of the media outlets, and the viewpoint is very narrow. There's not much diversity in what we're getting these days. You know, in the healthcare industry, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act prohibits future physician investments in hospitals. In the CPA industry, non-certified public accountants are in most states prohibited from being able to work in CPA firms. In the manufacturing industry, there's numerous laws to segregate the manufacturers from the retailers of their products, and the intent of those statutes is been specifically stated to be to eliminate industry practices that may be reasonably thought to operate unfairly or coercively. So this is not just something that's going on in the alcohol industry. This is something that's going on in a lot of industries. Fortunately for the alcohol industry, because our predecessors were wise enough to see what the problems were and to see that, you know, diversity in the profit motive was critical, and structuring the system to have 3 separate segments to minimize the opportunities for influence or control. We don't have the problems that a lot of these other industries have. So I think that those are important things to remember going forward, you know, for the marketplace. Another common issue that's going on across the states is direct shipment. So I think that most states now allow direct shipment of wine, and I saw in looking at your guys' statutes here in Pennsylvania that you also recently enacted that. I mean, I think that there will be challenges coming down the pipes from people in the beer segment of the industry and the spirit segment that want to direct ship their products as well. The biggest things as a regulator that I've seen with direct shipment is that it's very hard to regulate. You know, like, regulators don't have jurisdiction to go. We have jurisdiction over alcoholic beverage outlets that are licensed with us. We don't have jurisdiction to go to someone's house to check if they're delivering to a minor. So we don't really know who's ordering the product or where it's going. And then you have the issue of, I mean, you can require, in Louisiana, we require anyone that's going to direct ship to have a license with the state. I think that the Pennsylvania law does the same thing from what I was reading. However, there's no long-arm statute. So if someone's like doing something in another state, we really don't know. And if it's going directly to a consumer, like, we don't have the mail monitoring it for us, so we really don't know where it's coming, and that affects revenue collections because those products aren't being taxed, you know, with the excise or the sales tax. So that's double tax collection, and it also affects the brick and mortar businesses in the states who are not able to compete as fairly when someone is selling the same products that they're trying to sell in their stores online. I know there's a lot of push from the retail chains when the market is turbulent and the economy is down and internet sales are so big. Retail outlets or brick and mortars are looking for ways to get more customers into stores, so they're pushing for more deregulation on the alcohol front because alcohol does bring people into stores, and that's not a secret. They have admitted that that is what they're doing. When the system originally started post-prohibition, the biggest issue with the Tied House laws was the suppliers controlling everything. Well, as I've said, you know, the system continues to be relevant today, but I would offer that I believe the system is more relevant today because, you know, in addition to having more products and a bigger industry, you also have large retailers that are now pressuring suppliers to pay to play. So the Tied House angle and the mission of that is going both ways these days.
1 minute.
All right. Well, great.
Okay.
Wow, that was a fast minute.
Next, we have Vicky McDowell to address the challenges in the spirits industry, especially as it relates to efforts to deregulate and control state wine.
I represent a trade association of distilled spirits suppliers. It's called the President's Forum of the Distilled Spirits Industry. We're national. We represent primarily small and mid-sized companies. Many are family-owned and or operated. And our members, the sales of their products represent it's about 55% of the spirits sold in the United States. And we represent about 30% of the distilled spirits sold here in Pennsylvania. And by the way, I forgot to mention, it's really great to be home. I was born and raised in Pennsylvania, very familiar with the control system. And I guess on some sub or unconscious level, I really like the control system because when I moved on down the road to Montgomery County, Maryland, which is also a controlled jurisdiction. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the mission of our trade association, our members feel very strongly that, you know, we want to ensure that there is safe and moderate consumption of our products, and that our products are marketed and advertised in a very responsible manner. We like the existing regulatory framework. In other words, we want to be regulated appropriately. We do not want to see any further deregulation in our industry, you know, in the United States. And we strongly support the 21st Amendment. Now, everybody says you support the various amendments, but what that means for us is you will not find us coming into a state and making demands. That's not what we're about. We respect your rights to regulate alcohol as you see fit in the various states. Probably the best example I could give is you will not find us coming into a state demanding Sunday sales. We feel that decisions need to be made based on your constituency. We would instead focus on broader issues, as I said, like, you know, responsible advertising and marketing. Because as you've heard several times today, alcohol is not milk and cookies. It has to be regulated. We do business in all 50 states. You know, as Jessica mentioned, there are what are called open or licensed states and control states such as Pennsylvania. We like them all. But what we especially like in the control model is the very level, everybody knows what the rules are to get listed, and everybody plays by the same rules. I have small companies, and I've got some, you know, I would say mid-sized to large companies. They all play by the same rules. So a very small company can achieve success in a control system and control state right alongside a very large multinational corporation. So to us, that is a tremendous value that is provided in the control system. Some of the threats, oh, by the way, Todd, still here. I want to make one comment. I think you said that suppliers or distillers are pushing for 3 liters to be sold. I don't know, has that passed yet in Pennsylvania? Has that passed? Does anybody know? Okay, well, I just want, for the record, this trade association has not been pushing for that. Some of the threats that we see to state-based regulation. You've heard this several times this morning. I'm feeling a little bit redundant being on the last panel here, but lack of enforcement of trade practice laws. We see an erosion to that level playing field that we all talk about and that we want. Why is there a lack of enforcement of trade practice laws? What's the obvious answer?
Money.
Money, funding, right. You don't have enough resources. I mean, I could launch into that and we would be here all afternoon, but you know, the states have and so do the feds. I mean, I worked at ATF-TTB. There's so many regulations on the books. And with funding cuts that have taken place both at the federal and state level, you can't possibly enforce all those laws. So when I'm out in a state talking to folks, and they talk to me about, you know, they're concerned about things of value, you know, they're worried about napkins or cups or whatever. And I always ask them to take a step back, if you will, and look at the broader picture and pick what are your top 5 or 6 or 10 priorities in your state and try to focus on those. But then another thing that makes us crazy is what I call selective enforcement. You know, you've got laws and regulations on the books. It's very difficult for industry to try to figure out, well, which regulations are going to be enforced or which laws are going to be enforced, which are not. So it takes an effort to sort of clear out things that don't make sense to you in the states anymore. I know Iowa is in the process, you know, they've just gone through this process of looking at all of their regulations and how can they they modernize them, keep what is important, but if there are things that don't make sense, maybe get rid of them. So I do encourage states to do that. Another threat that we see, again, has been mentioned, demands of the large retailers of suppliers. And as Rob mentioned, TTB does not reach retailers. So when large retailers place demands on suppliers who want to get their products into those retail shops, that then puts the supplier's federal permit in jeopardy. So they're really between a rock and a hard place. They want to get their products on the shelves, but they also don't want to violate any of the federal laws that then can jeopardize and cost them greatly. So, gray market is another area that concerns us. Now, in Pennsylvania, you recently had a case, I believe. I'm not sure if it was Pappy's, that would be a guess, but something was being sold on Craigslist, and PLCB, I think, nabbed the guy. So that's great because we.
PLCB, not LC. No.
Okay. But the whole gray market area is of concern. When I was at TTB, we had two primary goals. One was to collect the revenue, collect the taxes. The other was to protect the consumer. Well, early on, we did a tax gap, so to speak, and there really isn't one. We found that the industry, in terms of paying their taxes, is very highly compliant. I think when we saw the results of the tax gap, it was something like 0.000 something. So collecting the taxes, that wasn't an issue. I always worried about gray market. I always worried about, okay, what if somebody pulls up in a truck, they have a couple of, extra cases or bottles of something, a retailer buys it, and God forbid, somebody gets sick, and, or dies, in the case of methanol poisoning. So that's always a concern, the whole gray market area. And as, again, has been mentioned, the different treatment of suppliers in-state, out-of-state, or large versus small, talking about carve-outs. That's a bit of concern to suppliers. And then just the overall erosion of the three-tier system. It has worked since the 1930s. I think it's something that as a country we should be very proud of, and we don't want to see any more erosion to the three-tier system. I think it's been very orderly, and a lot of the direct shipping and all these other issues just, I don't know, a little bit cause for concern. On privatization concerns, I know that's been talked about here in Pennsylvania as in some other states recently. But I think overall it's very difficult for a control jurisdiction to privatize successfully. Usually it has to do with revenue. And what you will see is you might get a lot of revenue in the first year or two, but in the long run, it just doesn't seem to work. And we don't take a position publicly one way or the other, but what we will do is offer information and data that we have to decision makers. We didn't get involved in Washington State, and I think there's the consensus is that privatization didn't go very well. So we are, as I said, we're not going to push any particular position, but we certainly are available to share information and thoughts when public policy is being debated or discussed. I was going to talk about Washington State, but I think Neil Inslee did a terrific job this morning, so we'll skip that. I'll mention my little county down the road, Montgomery County, Maryland. There was a big push to privatize that. There were some issues with distribution and the drivers and whatever. So the county executive established a task force. And within something like, I think it was 6 months, he included people from all different parts of the community, the retailers, the suppliers, the chambers of commerce. It was a good mix. So I had the opportunity to go to each one of these task force meetings, and the county executive just had one charge. He said, I'm open to privatizing. I want to fix this, but I have one requirement. I need $30 million from whatever we do, because that's the money I get from the Department of Liquor Control every year. So I need to protect that money. And it was fascinating to me because I heard all kinds of ideas being tossed about and talked about in these task force meetings, but never once did anyone come up with a solution for how to protect $30 million a year for the county budget. So unfortunately, after all of that, they're nowhere. Back to what I said about I think it's about revenue, and it's how to protect that revenue for coming years. So I think I'm going to stop there. We had hoped to have some discussion with the group, and I think Lester has some comments to make too.
Lester?
Yeah, I have a deck of slides. I'm not gonna present them just because for the interest of time, but I do want one picture
Okay.
out of my slides. Because I've become very lazy as an economist, and I found that one picture is worth 1,000 words.
Is it that
Keep
one?
going, nope, it's not that one, it's not that one, it's not that one, it's not that one, it's not that one. Just you wait, you're gonna know it when you see it. One more, there we go. All right, so basically the threats and the opportunities and the challenges for the three-tier system have fascinated me for the last couple of years because what we see happening is economic and it's demographic. Things are changing and they're changing fast. We've been hearing that for years. But the reality is that today the baby boomers are all grown up and the baby boomers are about to retire and the millennials are all grown up. And what that means is that without an echo boom in the near future, because millennials have not started to form households the same way Gen Xers did or the same way the baby boomers did, it means that the vast majority of our population is over 21. They don't have parental responsibilities, and they're ready to party. Basically put, around the country, businesses are keen on this. They realize it, they recognize it. And not only do businesses recognize it, your state and economic development authorities recognize this. Can anyone imagine 20 years ago the state governor getting up Saturday morning, getting on TV and telling everyone to map out a beer trail? Let's all hop in our car and go on a ride and sample beer, wine, and liquor around the country. I don't care if it's the Kentucky Bourbon Trail, if it's the New Hampshire Beer Trail, if it's the Austin Hill Country Wine Tour, if it's the Pennsylvania Beer Trail. Around the country, we are trying to get people out in their vehicles, driving around, drinking alcohol. And it is, don't tell me that, this is our reality. And you have zoos from Philadelphia to Baltimore to San Diego that all have happy hours now. Now, how many people, when they were young, remember asking their dad and begging them to go to the zoo with them? I do. Now, the roles are now reversed. In my mind, I see dads getting up and begging their kids to go to the zoo with them so they can have some brew zoo. And that's just the reality of it. California, 45,000 barbershops and saloons now have the opportunity to serve alcohol beverages. 45,000. So you see that guy down in the right-hand corner? He's getting his hair cut in the left-hand corner. He's getting his hair cut. He's not smart because he has a glass of wine, which the clippings fall into. He should have a bottle of beer, which would minimize the amount of clippings in your alcoholic beverage drink. However, my point is this, is that the economy is changing, the demographics are changing, and it is putting pressure on what we do, how we do it, and where we do it. And where alcohol beverages are made available are increasing and every day. And we see that in the number of breweries, which are up past 6,000, maybe on to 7,000, number of wineries, number of distilleries. Many of these guys are actually looking at both being manufacturers as well as retailers of that product. My picture in the middle there is the picture of the Whole Foods market from Austin, Texas. Whole Foods has a brewery in their grocery store. They have a bar in their grocery store, and they have packaged goods ready for sale in their grocery store. This is a retailer that operates across all three tiers of the business. And they like that model a lot because people come in, they have a drink, they make a growler full of beer, they buy some food, they buy some liquor, and out they go, and it's a one-stop shop. And they actually also get to manufacture it, which gives them a whole really nice competitive advantage. And the picture of there's a picture there of the Oklahoma theater, that's the Brew Flicks. This is a movie theater dedicated to selling beer and watching movies. Now, I don't know if you guys have Alamo draft houses here, but around the country out in Southwest, having a beer with your movie is a big thing. Mostly you don't see that much around here, but it is now a format that is becoming more and more prevalent around the country. So as our economy changes, as our demographics change, as our workforce place changes, we're going to see profound changes in how people want to drink, where they want to drink, and when they want to drink, and that will put pressure. And they're not just threats, but there are a lot of opportunities too, but there's opportunities, threats, and challenges all to these changing demographic and economic circumstances. So that's my big comment. I have a whole deck here. I could go on for hours, but I think that is the synthesis of what I want to say for this panel.
I was just thinking about the haircut and the clippings. I guess it's possible that that guy's name is Doug, and so what's happening there is he's enjoying hair of the Doug.
Did you write that down?
I did. I wrote that down so I wouldn't forget it, yeah. Okay, well, no more bad puns. I've got a few questions here that I wanted to sort of use to kick off the discussion, and I hope that all of you all will feel free to jump in. First, Jessica and Vicky, based on your experiences as a regulator and then as a representative for suppliers, what sorts of things do you wish policymakers would, what questions do you wish that they would ask, or what sorts of things do you wish that they would try to keep in mind before they begin to reform or think about reforming alcohol laws? And then for Lester, asking him to use draw from his Economist toolbox and talk a little bit about what sort of things trade off against one another when you begin to monkey around with the alcohol, with our current regulatory regime. Discuss.
Yeah,
Discuss.
I think my biggest thing, and I guess this is maybe a little bit indirectly going to your question, I think the regulators really need to work closely with their legislatures and the committees that have oversight over the alcohol regulations and laws, and to work to educate them of the history so that they really understand why we have what we have in the alcoholic beverage industry. Because, Tide House and trade practice, these are very vague concepts for people that aren't involved in the alcoholic beverage industry. And I think that helping them when they're doing their legislation to have this history in their background. So, maybe some small symposiums with those committees and their staff, so you can just answer questions and engage, like a roundtable, trade practice 101. I think that goes a long way in helping them. And then also I think that the policymakers should engage with all players and with the public health groups whenever they're considering a piece of legislation to really understand how that is going to impact everyone and how that's going to play out down the long road, so that globally they can make a decision on, is that a path that they want to go down or not. I think that everyone wants to encourage growth and change and new businesses. I have some clients that are represented by groups in the pictures, and I don't think that change is bad. I mean, obviously we're going to change and grow, but I think that the key thing to keep in mind is temperance and moderation, which has been the goal since the development of the system. We want to make things flexible enough so that people can get alcohol the way they want to do now, but strict enough that we prevent the problems that came before. And I think that if you keep that aim in mind, then you will make changes that will allow advancement and growth, but keeping the core principles in place for the system.
I agree with Jessica. I would add that while I was at TTB, we always said, and as far as I know it's still true, that we felt that we were partners with industry and with stakeholders. Our administrator would say, well, not equal partners, but we are definitely partners. And I think it is important to work with all of the stakeholders when policymakers are considering changes or lawmakers are considering changes. I would encourage them to not only speak with the regulators in the state, but also talk to some of the suppliers. As I said earlier, we're in 50 states. You've got 50 variations on a theme in terms of how alcohol is regulated. And we're very happy to share our thoughts and information, with policymakers. As I said, we're not coming into a state and demanding anything, but we do have experience and data that we're more than happy to share.
I'm going to switch back to a chart I have here. So when you look at the trade-offs, what we have is an industry that is basically a zero-sum game, and we don't realize it. We, as a country, consume pretty much consistently the same amount of ethanol every year. Nationally, we consume about 2.5 gallons of pure ethanol, and what happens, it's how we consume it, which is changing. We get more of it now through wine and spirits and less through beer than we did 10 years ago. And that's total US, and that's about 2.5. And if you switch to PA, it's below. It's around 2 gallons of pure ethanol. And the amazing thing is that most people think that we are actually increasing the pie as we change regulations and as we change that. But the reality is we are just sharing the pie out to different players in different formats, at different times, in different places. And it's really important for people to recognize that it's not a growing pie. We've had alcohol on our planet for a very, very long time, and it's not a new thing. Now, granted, we do have that delineal age of 21 that cuts people off from it. For the most part, over time, we have been pretty good at consuming the same amount of alcohol year in and year out. So when it comes to what are the trade-offs are all those things I talked about with my picture earlier, is how much more opportunity and how wider spread the opportunities are.
Thanks. Well, let's open it up to questions for our panel of experts here, unless either Vicky or Jessica have anything else to add.
Oh no, have we put you to sleep?
Good afternoon. How are you?
Good.
I'm Representative Adam Harris. I have the opportunity this session to chair the House Liquor Control Committee. I guess the question I had is, unfortunately, I wasn't here this morning. Could you give maybe a brief synopsis of what went wrong in Washington State from your experience?
All right, and I'm going to ask Pam Erickson to feel free to jump in on this, but prices went up. A lot of the mom and pop stores couldn't survive, went out of business. There was more convenience. I don't think there's any debate about that. I have heard Oregon and Idaho say that privatization of Washington was the best thing that ever happened to them because of border bleed or people going from Washington and the other states to purchase products. So it just, Pam, or other things, you're doing research right now. There's still some studies going on with regard to what happened and, did it work or not. But the consensus as of right now is really wasn't a good deal.
Yeah, and you have to wait a few more years before you fully understand the implications, because some of the public health problems take a long time, like liver cirrhosis builds up over time and so forth. I think the fundamental problem is never let a corporation write your statutes for you. The ballot measure was 40 pages of Washington statutes written by Costco. And how many voters really read that? I read it several times, and I didn't pick up all the benefits for Costco. They were enormous. And so I think that's the fundamental problem. One thing in the campaign, there was a clear expectation that prices would go down. Before the ballot measure passed, Washington had the highest spirits prices in the nation. Oregon was second. After the ballot measure was implemented, prices rose by an average of $2 a bottle. And they've pretty much stayed that way. And the reason is there was a promise to keep the same amount of revenue. Well, when the state takes the profit and you have several taxes, you have to replace the profit with another tax. They called it a fee, but it still it extracted a lot of money from the system, and then companies put profit on top of that. So that didn't materialize. I don't think that customers got quite the convenience they expected. Yeah, there are more outlets, but the big box stores now typically sell just the big sellers. So they'll maybe have 50 SKUs, whereas the typical state store had many, many more. And you do have a lot of big box liquor stores like Total Wine and Bevmo that have come into the States. The little stores, they auctioned off the state stores. Some people paid a lot of money for them, and many, many of them are now out of business. It also hurt some of the small distilleries and wineries, because when a big box store stocks product, they already have contracts with a lot of the big suppliers. So I haven't been able to find a lot of data about it, but the consensus is that California wine was the real beneficiary, because they produce large supplies of wine. Washington and Oregon wineries are primarily boutique. They don't have large supplies. They wouldn't be able to supply, a large number of big box stores. But they got listed in state stores, so they didn't have to have sales staffs. They just go to a listing meeting once and get their product listed. It was very easy. Now, in order to get their products in stores, they have to hire salespeople, they have to do promotions, they've got to, do all kinds of stuff. So, in my opinion, it was kind of a disaster. We are seeing a lot of. Initially, there were a lot of thefts. Immediately, hard liquor became the number one product that thieves take, and they had some organized crime theft rings that operated. That's been quelled as they've been able to increase security measures, but that was a problem, and it probably still is a problem. The greater problem are things like increase in DUIs, increase in injuries because of fights, and that kind of stuff. Underage drinking has not gone up. That's a good thing. But nationwide, underage drinking has been going down for several years, so they were kind of following a national trend. Whether that will continue, we don't really know.
And one of our members who was in Oregon, a small distillery, lost 50% of his business for what Pam was just describing. Suddenly he can't compete with the really large, well-known brands. It doesn't, they only want to take so many SKUs. Thanks, Pam.
Thank you. This is a question for Lester. I actually, seeing your slides so quickly, they looked fascinating, so I think we did maybe lose out on some interesting data.
I will certainly make them available to you. You can study them before you go to bed one night.
Thank you.
Not in the morning. I don't recommend it in the morning.
We're operating
What
heavy
I'm-
machinery.
Yeah, don't operate heavy machinery either.
Thank you. What I'm wondering is, and this is, my impression is that in the last 15, 20 years, or maybe 10, 15 years, that the alcohol content of beer on the average has risen, and probably risen significantly. When I was in my younger days, beer was, if you saw a 7% or 8%, that was huge. That was definitely something different. Where today, when I go out with my son to some tap houses, and I know I'm driving late at night, I'm desperately searching the menu for a beer with an alcohol content I'm comfortable drinking. But has there been any correlation or calculation showing that some of the volume decrease in beer sales is really the result of the higher alcohol content?
I love this conversation. Okay, there's a couple of parts to this you have to be aware of. Number one is we all go out to bars and restaurants and we watch what people are doing and we immediately assume that's what's happening. But only 2 out of every 10 beers are actually consumed on premise. 8 out of 10 are consumed in the privacy of our own homes. We don't really know what's going on in other people's homes. We know what's going on in our house, hopefully, but we don't know what's going on in all the other neighborhoods. So we go out on premise and we see the 7% beer or the 6% beer, and we immediately assume that that's what's happening in the homes too. And the reality is that I've been doing this for 10 years. I've been pulling down all the brands, multiplying their volumes times their ABV to get a weighted average total ethanol ABV for beer, and it comes out to about 4.6% every year. And that's because what we see out in the marketplace and we see in the bars and restaurants is this is what's going on everywhere. This is representative of 100% of alcohol consumption, and it's only representative of 20% of alcohol consumption. Meanwhile, the rest of the population and a lot of those people you see in the bars and restaurants are probably pulling a regular normal beer and taking it home to drink it while they cut the grass or watch TV. But their behavior is so different on premise versus off premise that we fail to separate it out. So then we immediately jump to this consumer that, well, the 6%, 7%, 8% IPA is driving up average alcohol. But the reality is these are kind of like leaders for the alcohol beverage. Most brewers do have a high ABV brand, but most people might taste that brand and like 1 or 2 of them, but the majority of the time they're going to that more subdued 5% flagship brand. Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, 5.5%. Torpedo, 7%. Everyone likes to have a torpedo when they go out, but the reality is they probably drink Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, which is about 5%, at home. You could go through the list of small brewers, and you'll see that happening, that they all have these high ABV kind of front brands that they like to put out in the marketplace to show how great they are and how innovative they are and how different they are. But they all have flagship brands that are kind of 5% beers, which they've always been. So be careful. What you see in the bars and restaurants is representative of about 20% of the beers. The other 80% are behind closed doors, and unless you have a drone with a little camera and you're snooping on everyone's house, we don't know what's going on with those other 80% of that volume. But that's a great question. I love having that talk because we've had those arguments for years that, yeah, you would think that, if, a 3 higher ABV craft beers would replace 2 regular Bud Lights or Miller Lights. And that argument's been around for a while. But, unfortunately, there's wine as an alternative, there's spirits as an alternative, there's traditional macro beers, there's craft beers. There's so much competing for share of stomach, share of mind, share of wallet, that it's really hard from an economic standpoint or from a statistical standpoint to really hone in and say, I observe this, but is it really true?
Does everybody remember Schaefer beer?
Uh-huh.
A fine product. A friend of mine in college had a sign that hung up on the door that he had gotten from a convenience store in Fort Worth, Texas, and the motto was, when you're having more than one.
But yeah, a lot of beer is still sold, craft beers represent 10%, 11% of the market, and that's, and then you cut it into the on and off premise, and it doesn't really move the average that much.
Lester, do you have a slide that talks about the economic impact of the industry?
I do.
Would you please?
There's so much good stuff in this deck. Decisions. And I'm going the wrong way. Am I going the wrong way? Go to the front, please. It's right up front. Go up, please. Thank you. There we are. That one. So yeah, the economic impact. So yes, this is Pennsylvania's economic impact across all three tiers and across all three segments. We measure it by job and we measure it by dollar impact. So for example, at the very, you see the manufacturing job counts. There's about 4,000 people working in beer, wine, and spirits. Production as a supplier in the state. Wholesaling gets you about 5,300, and then retailing, which is the front man for the entire industry, takes you all the way up to almost 70,000, which gives you a total of direct jobs, people directly employed in the three tiers at almost 79,000 jobs. But what's more important for economic impact is the fact that these jobs support other people in the economy. So there are direct and indirect jobs in there, and induced and indirect jobs in there. So yes, if you're a regulator and you're a government employee, you are part of that indirect job in there. If you are an accountant servicing a brewer or a retailer or a wholesaler, you're counted in there. If you're a lawyer working for one of those people, you would be considered part of that indirect. And then everyone goes out and gets their hair cut. We don't all necessarily have a glass of wine when we do it, but when we do go out and get our hair cut and fill up our gas tank, then all those induced jobs follow behind the direct jobs as well. So you can come down, and when you do an economic impact study, you find that almost 133,000 people in the state of Pennsylvania make a living through alcohol beverage in some way. It's a big number. And and we can turn that all, you can go down one more. You can turn that all into dollars as well. When you when you look at the value added in each stage of the system, you end up with almost a $16 billion industry in the state of Pennsylvania. So it's a meaningful industry, and it has a lot of ramifications for many, many people across the state. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know what the impact of jobs is in a situation where it goes to a privatized system? Do you have data from Washington or other states?
No, I don't. But that would be interesting to see.
Lester, I've heard you frequently get a question about, at legislatures particularly, about adding jobs. And I've heard you counter that with maybe you're just replacing other jobs. Could you comment on that issue?
Sure. If you remember that earlier slide, which showed the 2 gallons per pure ethanol for Pennsylvania and 2.5 for the U.S., well, once again, we're not really creating more demand for alcohol year in and year out in the country. I mean, the demand is there. It's a relatively mature industry, great consumer awareness, and so when people come, when economic development authorities come out and they start trying to promote alcohol beverage as a job creator in an environment where consumption is flat, you're really just rearranging deck chairs. You're squeezing the balloon and the air is going from one side to the other side. The addition of net new jobs is not really an option at that point. And it becomes less economic development and more, rearranging jobs around the state or the city or wherever you're trying to move that.
This is more an observation than a question, but similarly, when you look at it in terms of businesses, when you had that slide up earlier that showed the per capita consumption, remaining that constant, and then when you look at outlet density and expansion of retail outlets, in the crazy piece about 45,000 barbershops and salons in California can now sell. Something that's very important for policymakers, I think, to keep in mind is if the pie stays the same and you're going to double or whatever the number of retail outlets that are going to be selling the product, you're just slicing the pie a lot smaller. And one of the dangers in this industry is you're going to put more small businesses on that borderline where they're just hanging on. And those kinds of businesses are going to be more likely to push the envelope as it relates to sales to minors. sales to intoxicated individuals and not being quite as responsible because they're trying to hang on. And that, in this industry, is something that I think you do need to keep in mind when you look at that tremendous outlet expansion at the retail level.
Yes.
Incentives matter, right?
Incentives do
I said
matter.
incentives matter.
Great. Well, most of this information is all publicly available information, so it's not proprietary in any way. The way I put the pictures together are. But that's irrelevant. So, but feel free to, if you want a copy of it, let me know. I'll certainly send you the deck, and if you want any more explanation on it, I'll certainly provide that as well.
Lester, to the point they were just making, you do have one slide that shows kind of the declining number of traditional bars, restaurants, and taverns, right?
Do.
Or bars and taverns. So, as we're talking about winners,
It's right
there's
after
also
that
this,
one.
there's
Right.
certainly losers.
Yeah, there's
as
always
well.
winners and losers. And the big news that we've seen is that there's a decline. Anyone ever been to a VFW or Legion's Club or an Elk Club? Those around the country are declining rapidly because that was a segment of the alcohol beverage on-premise market that has seen a decrease in the number of patrons. So as those guys close, you see these traditional bars, which, around the country, just traditional bars that make the majority of their money from selling alcohol beverages, and maybe they put some pretzels and peanuts on the side, those have actually been decreasing year in and year out around the country. There's fewer and fewer of them every day. Meanwhile, we see movie theaters, zoos, hair salons, and beer trails popping up all over the place, which is sticking to that theme of constant consumption. I'm not going to drink it here, but I'm going to go drink over there.
You see a similar theme in, I've taught in England, and there were a couple of summers that I was there, and every day in the paper, there was another story about pubs closing all over England because people were doing their drinking at home.
Right, because the price,
Because of the retail price,
the
they could
grocery
use-
store price
yeah.
had plummeted so much, they just pushed all those people away.
Tesco and Sainsbury's could use alcohol as a loss leader, and so people were buying cheap alcohol and drinking it at home. Also, because you could smoke at home too, and they had banned smoking
yes.
in pubs as well. Any other questions? Well, thank you all so much for being
Great.
here. Let's have a big round of applause for our panel. And just generally, I wanted to thank you all for joining us today to learn more about state-based system of alcohol regulation and the decisions to be made for the future of the industry here in the Commonwealth. And if you're interested in receiving a copy of today's presentations, just please inquire with Danielle at the desk or send us an email at info@centerforalcoholpolicy.org. And if you enjoyed what you saw today or are interested in learning more and networking with other professionals in the field, the Center will host its 10th annual Alcohol Law and Policy Conference September 6th through the 8th in Chicago. And you can find more information about it at our website, www.centerforalcoholpolicy.org. And of course, feel free to stop by and see Danielle for more information. Several of us will be around following the conclusion of the forum, so if you want to speak directly to any of us, we'd be happy to chat with you. And just about the Law and Policy Conference, I've probably been going, I think, since maybe the second one, and I think that they have consistently gotten stronger every single year, and some of the ones that we've had the last several years have been really, really outstanding. Lots of good perspectives from regulators, suppliers, public health people, really worthwhile if you can join us. So again, thank you for spending your day with us, and I hope to see you all in Chicago. Thank you.